early American literature friends. This video is a short guide through chapters 6 and then 8, 9, and the beginning of chapter 10. And we're going to dive just a little into chapter 10. Chapter 10 is the big one. It's a long chapter. So we're going to get going in it and then stop there. So this one will guide you through 6 and 8, 9, and 10, the beginning of 10. We're skipping over 7 because it really just develops a lot of the things that Frederick Douglass talks about in chapter 6. He talks about learning to read, about becoming literate. Chapter 7 really just expands on that, and it's useful detail about him sort of reading and his sense that reading will be the pathway to freedom. But he gives you a lot of the big ideas and a lot of his famous quotes about talking about literacy and seeing it as the sort of gateway to freedom he gives you in chapter 6. So let's jump into chapter 6. You get that. He gives you a further description of Sophia Auld right there. And this also gives you one of his, when he talks about Sophia Auld, he gives you one of his central ideas about slavery, which is his notion that slavery is a poison that poisons everybody involved. It poisons the slaves, obviously, you're being held in bondage, but it also poisons the slaveholder. And for him, Sophia Auld is the perfect example of this, and he explains why right at the beginning of chapter 6. My new mistress proved all she appeared to be when I first met her, a woman of the kindest heart and finest feelings. She had never had a slave under her control previously. So for Frederick Douglass, here's one reason why she's a perfect test case. She's never had a slave. Frederick Douglass is the first interaction that she has had with a slave under her control. And prior to her marriage, she had been dependent upon her own industry for a living. So not only had she never had a slave, but before being married, she had worked. So she has some notion of what work is and what it is like to work. And so she both knows what it's like to work for herself, and to then now she has control of another human being for the first time. So she was not born into slavery. She has no experience with it. And not only that, but she knows what it's like to have to support yourself. I was utterly astonished at her goodness. I scarcely knew how to behave towards her. She was utterly unlike any other white woman I'd ever seen. And then you jump down to that second paragraph. Alas, this kind heart had but a short time to remain such. The fatal poison of irresponsible power was already in her hands. That is Frederick Douglass's central notion about the system of slavery as a whole, as he understands it, that it is a fatal poison of irresponsible power. He will talk about the system of slavery over and over again throughout his career, but right here he gives you what always stays his core idea about the system of slavery as a whole. The whole thing is just a poison of irresponsible power, a fatal poison of irresponsible power. Very soon after I went to live with Mr. and Mrs. Auld, after he gives you that, he then transitions into talking about how Sophia Auld helped him learn how to read. Very soon after I went to live with Mr. and Mrs. Auld, she very kindly commenced to teach me the ABC. This is the beginning of the third paragraph of chapter 6. Very soon after I went to live with Mr. and Mrs. Auld, after I learned this, she assisted me in learning to spell words of 3 or 4 letters. Just at this point in my progress, Mr. Auld found out what was going on and at once forbade Mrs. Auld to instruct me further, telling her, among other things, that it was unlawful as well as unsafe to teach a slave to read. This is one of the most famous and important paragraphs, if you take this paragraph as a whole, and it's a relatively long paragraph. You can see down here, it's a long paragraph. This is one of the central and most famous paragraphs of all of Frederick Douglass. Because of what he explains at the end, you get Mr. Auld's explanation about how the more ignorant slaves are, the better, because it will make them less likely to resist and to try to escape. But it will also, even if they never resist or try to escape, the more that they know and the more that they understand about the wider, broader world, they will be unhappy, he says. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable. There's the might run away, resist. As to himself, it could do him no good, but a great deal of harm. It would make him discontented and unhappy. There's the second half of it, where he says, even if he didn't want to resist and try to run away, or become, unwilling to follow directions, he would know that he was a slave. He would have a clear understanding of his condition, and that would make him discontented and unhappy. These words sank deep into my heart and called into existence an entirely new train of thought. It was a new and special revelation. So Douglass says it's a revelation for him. I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. It was just what I wanted, and I got it at a time when I least expected it. And so for him, learning how to read, it opens this doorway to all this information, both this sort of like understanding how he might get to the free parts of the country, but this sort of what he understands to be this sort of secret knowledge. The very decided manner with which he spoke and strove to impress his wife with the evil consequences of giving me instruction served to convince me that he was deeply sensible of the truths he was uttering. What he most dreaded, that I most desired. What he most loved, that I most hated. That which to him which was a great evil to be carefully shunned was to me a great good. In the last part of that paragraph, he says, in learning to read, I owe almost as much to the bitter opposition of my master, Mr. Auld, as to the kindly aid of my mistress. I acknowledge the benefit of both. So once Sophia Auld, before her husband stops her, is teaching Frederick Douglass to read. But when Frederick Douglass hears all the Mr. Auld's reasoning for not wanting him to become literate, that is just as important and powerful in convincing him that Frederick Douglass, wants to learn to read because it will give him some kind of power. So he says, like, Mr. Auld not wanting me to learn anything affected me as much as Mrs. Auld beginning to teach me. That's where you get that I acknowledge the benefit of both Mr. Auld and Mrs. Auld's effect on him. And then the whole rest of chapter 6 is devoted to, it's a short chapter, and the whole rest is really just one long paragraph. He talks about how city slaves are treated much better than country slaves, not because slave owners in the city are better, but because they do not want to be judged by their neighbors as being harsh or hateful or mean slaveholders. And what he gives you in that last paragraph is, he says, this is just generally true. City slaves are much better off because the slave masters don't want to be judged and seem to be mean or cruel. He talks about how the people that live across the street from him, though, in Baltimore are like this sort of exception to it, and especially the wife is especially harsh and brutal, beating her slaves. He says, there are, however, some painful exceptions to this rule. Directly opposite to us on Philpott Street lived Mr. Thomas Hamilton. He owned 2 slaves. Their names were Henrietta and Mary. And Henrietta and Mary are abused by Mrs. Hamilton. But he reads and it's awful, obviously it's awful, but he reads this as an exception. He brings this up because it's an exception to his sense that city slaves are much better off. Again, chapter 7, we're not going to go through chapter 7, we're not reading chapter 7, but what he really does is, even after Mr. Auld stops Mrs. Auld from helping him to learn to read, he goes out and finds newspapers and gets textbooks from the other kids in the neighborhood and continues to learn to read better and better and better. Like, he builds on what the foundation that Mrs. Auld helps him with, and learns to becomes more and more literate on his own. Chapter 8 brings an end, and I'm going to scroll down here. Give me just a second to chapter 8. Chapter 8 gives you this first disruption to his life in Baltimore. Let's jump down here. Here we go. Chapter 8. In a very short time after I went to live in Baltimore, my old master's youngest son, Richard, died. So you have to remember, Captain Anthony has 3 children, the 2 brothers, and then Lucretia. And he belongs to Lucretia. And technically, because Lucretia is a woman, she was married, he belongs to Lucretia's husband, Thomas Auld. So the first of Captain Anthony's children dies. Richard died, and in about 3 years and 6 months after his death, my old master, Captain Anthony, died, leaving only his son Andrew and his daughter Lucretia to share his estate. He died while on a visit, and he left no will at the disposal of his property. It was therefore necessary to have a valuation of the property, that it might be equally divided between Miss Lucretia and Master Andrew. This is one of the traumas of Frederick Douglass's young life, because he gets to Baltimore, things are better, he's learning to read, his life is clearly on this upslope, and then he is sent for because now the property has to be divided between the 2 remaining children, Lucretia and Andrew. It was therefore necessary to have a valuation of the property. I was immediately sent for to be valued with the other property. Here again, my feelings rose up in detestation of slavery. And so, because of his experience in Baltimore, he now has a sense of like how dehumanizing it is to be valued along with the other like livestock and property and something like that. The ship comes and gets him and takes him back to the plantation. I found myself, after a sail of about 24 hours, I found myself near the place of my birth. I had now been absent from it almost, if not quite, 5 years. So he's somewhere between 10 and 12 years old at this point. It's unclear, and he gives you kind of conflicting information. I remember the place very well. I was only about 5 years old when I left. So it's unclear if he's 5, 6, 7 when he leaves. So he could be 10, 11, 12 right here, somewhere in there. We were all ranked together at the evaluation, and this is why I used the word livestock, because Douglas uses sort of gives you that suggestion right here. We were all ranked together. Men and women, old and young, married and single, were ranked with horses, sheep, and swine. There were horses and men, cattle and women, pigs and children, all holding the same rank in the scale of being. So again, he mixes together. He doesn't say horses, cattle, and pigs, and then men, women, and children. He says horses and men, cattle and women, pigs and children. And he very intentionally mixes the people and the livestock together because he wants you to see that that's how they're being treated, and that's how it feels to be just sort of valued as a piece of property, as a piece of livestock. Frederick Douglass has this sort of, after the valuation, then came the division. I have no language to express the high excitement and deep anxiety which was felt among us poor slaves during this time. He has several days of anxiety and stress. He doesn't know what's going to happen to him, if he's going to get back to go to Baltimore or have to stay at the plantation. It is ultimately decided that he is going to be sent back to Baltimore. He says, I suffered more anxiety than most of my fellow slaves. I had known what it was to be kindly treated. They had known nothing of the kind. But then you jump down to that next paragraph. Thanks to a kind providence. And if you remember, providence is this 17th, 18th century language for like the will of God, the sort of hand of God, God acting on your behalf. I fell to the portion of Miss Lucretia and was sent immediately, who is the person who technically owns him at this point anyway, so he just stays with who owned him, and was sent immediately back to Baltimore to live again in the family of Master Hugh. Their joy at my return equaled their sorrow at my departure. It was a glad day to me. I had escaped worse than a lion's jaws. And it says he had been away from Baltimore for about a month during the valuation of the property, but then there is very soon after my return to Baltimore, my mistress Lucretia died, leaving her husband and one child, Amanda. And in a very short time after her death, Master Andrew died. So now Captain Anthony and all of his children are dead. And so he becomes the property of Lucretia's husband, Thomas Auld, who is technically his owner at this point anyway. The whole rest of this chapter, he kind of jumps you off of much of the rest of this chapter is this long sort of description of once Captain Anthony and all of his children are dead, the African-American woman who raised him, who Frederick Douglass refers to as his grandmother, and who raised him as a small child too. She was his nanny, his mammy, when he was a small child. You get this description, all the people that she had raised and had, he tells you that she had been there when Captain Anthony was born, had been there when he died, and was there when all of his children had died. She outlived all of them. But once they are all dead, once Captain Anthony and all of his children are dead, the owners that are still alive, who had nothing to do with building the wealth that bought these slaves, they build a cabin for the grandmother out in the woods and basically send her out there to die. And Frederick Douglass's point is they isolate her so that none of the other slaves can help her. There's no one to help her after she is helped. His specific language is, having seen the beginning and end of all of them, they took her to the woods, built her a little hut, put up a mud chimney, and then made her welcome to the privilege of supporting herself there in perfect loneliness, thus virtually turning her out to die. And so Douglass argues that she was the source of much of Captain Anthony's wealth and his children's wealth, because she had outlived all of them. She had been the mother and the grandmother of many of these slaves, the property at this point. And then when she's all used up, they just basically isolate her out in the woods to die. You get the hearth is desolate. The children, the unconscious children who once sang and danced in our presence, are gone. And you get the end of that paragraph. You understand how for him this is this moral and ethical wrong, because he says, will not a righteous God visit for these things? How can God allow this woman, this good woman who's seen these people through their birth and death, how can they just basically cast her out into the woods to die? In about 2 years after the death of Miss Lucretia, Master Thomas married his second wife. Her name was Rowena Hamilton. And then this chapter ends, the last 3 paragraphs here, what Douglas gives you here is Thomas Auld, then about 2 years after Lucretia dies, he remarries, and then he has a conflict right here. Not long after his marriage, a misunderstanding took place between himself and Master Hugh, and as a means of punishing his brother, he took me from him to live with himself at St. Michael's, back on the plantation. Here I underwent another most painful separation. It, however, was not so severe as the one I dreaded at the division of property. And he gives you this. I then had to regret that I did not at least make the attempt to carry out my resolution to run away. This is one of the first times Douglas brings up running away, and he brings it up right here in the context of he's leaving Baltimore. He knows he's going back to the plantation where it's going to be harder to run away, and so he's thinking, gosh, I should have just gone ahead and tried to run away before I got sent back home. And at this point, he is already a teenager. He is at least 14, maybe as old as 16, somewhere in that 14, 15, 16 age bracket. And this chapter ends with him, I sail from Baltimore for St. Michael's, with him being taken away from Baltimore, sent back to the plantation to live with Thomas Auld. My determination to run away was again revived, and I resolved to wait only so long as the offering of a favorable opportunity. When that came, I was determined to be off. This is, at the end of this chapter, is Frederick Douglass's first sort of expressing of his desire to practically attempt running away. Like, he has a sense of what compass direction he needs to go, how he would physically go, which direction that he watches the ships and which way they're sailing to Philadelphia. And he's like, if I ran away, this is the direction I would go. So you can feel him getting closer and closer to actually running away. This like coming up with a actual plan to run away and then acting it out. In chapter 9, he says, I have now reached a period in my life when I can give dates. I left Baltimore and went to live with Master Thomas at St. Michael's in March 1832. So it's the spring of 1832 right here. And that's somewhat important because he lives the rest of that year, 1832, with Thomas Auld. He and Thomas Auld have all these conflicts. Frederick Douglass almost immediately in these first paragraphs of chapter 9 explains how Thomas Auld is just awful. He says, you get that sentence, he was to me a new master and I to him a new slave. He talks about here it is. It's the next paragraph. Bad as all slaveholders are, we seldom meet one destitute of every element of character commanding respect. My master, Thomas Auld, was one of this rare sort. I do not know of one single noble act ever performed by him. If you want to understand Thomas Auld and Douglas's interaction with him and his perspective on him, you take that sentence. He describes how Thomas Auld doesn't give the slaves enough to eat. They're going hungry. And Douglas says the rule is no matter how bad the food, only let there be enough of it. And Thomas Auld doesn't even give you that. He just talks about how Thomas Auld, and he argues that Thomas Auld does not know how to treat slaves and how to handle slaves because he never made enough money to actually buy a slave. He just inherited all of his slaves from his father-in-law and from his wife. And so he is not a good slaveholder in any sense of the word. Douglas seems to make his argument that like this is what sort of poisons him as a slaveholder from the beginning and makes him such a bad slave owner. He says later in that same paragraph, he was a slave owner he was a slaveholder without the ability to hold slaves, is Douglas's great description of it. And he talks about how during the year of 1832, Thomas Auld has this like religious conversion, and Douglas thinks maybe this will make him be better and kinder. But he says actually it makes him worse because then he like believes that he has the power of religion behind his bad behavior and the sanction of religion for his like bad behavior towards the slaves. He also talks. You get that if you scroll all the way down to that next paragraph. He talks about how some of the slaves try to have a Sunday school to teach the other slaves something about the Bible and also to begin to teach them how to read and write. But several of the wealthy farm and plantation owners break up the school because they do not want any of the slaves becoming literate or learning anything. There was a white young man, a Mr. Wilson, who proposed to keep a Sabbath school for the instruction of such slaves as might be disposed to learn to read the New Testament. So they would both learn about Christianity, but learn to read. But then the other wealthy farm owners stopped that, put a stop to it again, because one of the things that is able to perpetuate the whole system of slavery is keeping slaves ignorant, as Douglas explains. He talks some more about Thomas Auld beating slaves and quoting the Bible as he is beating slaves. He that knoweth his master's will and doeth it not shall be beaten with many stripes. This is a really common, it's a really popular phrase back during this time period that was quoted to support slavery and to physically harm and abuse slaves. My master, and then you get to this paragraph. My master and myself had quite a number of differences. He found me unsuitable to his purpose. My city life, he said, had a very pernicious effect on me. It had almost ruined me for every good purpose, fitted me for everything which was bad. And he talks about how he would intentionally let Thomas Auld's horse run away to his father-in-law's, because he would go to his father-in-law's, Thomas Auld's father-in-law, Mr. Hamilton. Mr. Hamilton would give him enough to eat. So Douglas would intentionally let the horse run away so that he would have to go get it, and he would get something to eat while he was there. Master William Hamilton, my master's father-in-law, always gave his slaves enough to eat. I never left there hungry, no matter how great the need of my speedy return. But this has this cumulative effect, because by the end of 1832, Master Thomas at length said he would stand it no longer. I lived with him 9 months, during which time he had given me a number of severe whippings, all to no purpose. He resolved to put me out, he said, to be broken. And for this purpose, he let me for 1 year to a man named Edward Covey. Mr. Covey was a poor man, a farm renter. Mr. Covey had acquired a high reputation for breaking young slaves, and this reputation was of immense value to him. It enabled him to get his farm tilled with much less expense. Some slaveholders thought it not much loss to allow Mr. Covey to have their slaves 1 year for the sake of the training they would be subjected without any compensation. What Douglas is saying here is some slave owners just give their slaves to Mr. Covey for a year, and they don't expect anything for it. They don't expect any pay because they think it's worth it, because Mr. Covey is going to break their slaves, and they'll get their slaves back, and they won't resist, and will just be docile and will do what they're told. Added to the natural good qualities of Mr. Covey, he was a professor of religion, a pious soul, a member of a class leader in the Methodist Church. And so chapter 9 ends with, you get 9 months. Frederick Douglass goes back to the plantation from Baltimore. You get the last 9 months of 1832 with Thomas Auld. And then finally Thomas Auld is like, I can't control you. You've been ruined by your experience in Baltimore. You're not a good slave. And so he decides to send Frederick Douglass to this slave breaker for a year, for the year of 1833 with Mr. Covey. And that is where chapter 10 starts, is with Frederick Douglass. Chapter 10 starts with the beginning of 1833 when Frederick Douglass goes to live with Mr. Covey. You get that. I left Master Thomas's house, went to live with Mr. Covey on 1st of January 1833. I was now for the first time in my life a field hand. And in my new employment, I found myself even more awkward than a country boy appeared to be in a large city. We're going to stop right there. That gets us into chapter 10, but I'm going to make a different video. I'm going to give you a different video that gives you at the very least the first half of chapter 10, which is really the sort of the first 6 to 8 months of Frederick Douglass's experience with Mr. Covey, where he straight up says Mr. Covey succeeds in breaking him. So in the next video, we'll get into Mr. Covey breaking Frederick Douglass and what that looks like. And we'll get into how Frederick Douglass finally gets to the end of that breaking in August of 1833. So we're really dealing with those first 7, getting into August of 1833, and how Mr. Covey succeeds in breaking Frederick Douglass. I hope this video is useful to you for understanding, though, chapter 6, 8, 9, and then the very beginning, getting you into chapter 10. I hope y'all are doing well. If I can do anything for you, please don't hesitate to be in touch with me.